When a renowned professor at Brown University thought poking fun at Melania Trump was the perfect punchline, he never imagined Barron Trump's poised but electrifying response that day. In a lecture hall where intellectual bravado often steals the show, a single statement can reshape everything. Here, at the heart of campus debates, reputations are born, confidence is tested, and sometimes true character emerges when no one expects it. "All right, class," declared Professor Gregory Lang as he stood at the front of a modern auditorium filled with polished wooden desks and a massive digital screen. His voice echoed through the tiered seats, claiming the collective attention of over 200 students enrolled in political discourse and media relations. Lean, sharp-featured, and known for a flamboyant teaching style, Lang thrived on controversy. He believed it kept the mind agile, and more importantly, kept him at the center of every conversation. Barron Trump slipped into a seat in the middle row, not too close to the front but far from the very back. At 6'7", he drew attention merely by walking in. But over time, many in the class had grown accustomed to his tall frame and quiet reserve. Even so, a few heads turned when he arrived. Some recognized that distinctive last name. Others merely wondered who the towering presence was. Quiet, thoughtful, almost inscrutable. Barron rarely spoke, but when he did, people tended to listen. Today, that hush around him would be shattered. Lang tapped on the screen, triggering a slideshow about public perception of political figures. He clicked past photos of presidents and first ladies throughout history: Jackie Kennedy, Nancy Reagan, Michelle Obama. Then came the iconic image of Melania Trump, poised in a designer suit, standing before a row of flags. Without missing a beat, the professor offered a loaded smirk. "Now," he began, his voice growing louder, "we can discuss real policy contributions." Jacqueline Kennedy redefined the role of First Lady by focusing on arts and culture in the White House. Michelle Obama championed healthy eating and advocated for children's wellness on a massive scale. But let's talk about a certain Mrs. Trump. A few muffled laughs bubbled up in the rows closest to the front. Barron's gaze flickered to the screen, then back to the professor. He remained outwardly calm, though he recognized Lang's tone, the classic setup for a snide remark. "Melania," Lang said, letting the name linger in the air. "Some see her as an icon, others as an enigma, and still more," he paused, "just see her as a pretty face who lucked into a role she never asked for." In the second row, a girl with bright pink hair nudged her friend. They exchanged knowing looks, anticipating that the professor was just warming up. Meanwhile, a cluster of students in the back row shifted uncomfortably, aware that Barron Trump was in the room. "To be fair," Lang continued, "she did champion some projects like Be Best. But there's a certain irony, isn't there, when your husband is arguably the most brazen Twitter user on the planet, while you're preaching a message about online kindness." Laughter erupted in small pockets throughout the hall. Some joined in eagerly, craving the professor's approval. Others peered around, hesitant. Barron remained still, eyes fixed on the desk in front of him. "It's comedic gold," Lang said, spreading his arms theatrically. "A public campaign against cyberbullying coming from the White House's most notorious rabble-rouser. I mean, you can't write a better script if you tried." More laughs, louder this time. The professor's smirk deepened. He sensed the crowd was on his side. He loved pushing boundaries, especially when it involved the Trumps. It always generated strong reactions. Controversy meant engagement, and engagement meant a spotlight on him. But what he failed to realize was that not everyone found such jabs clever. Barron exhaled softly. He'd heard it all before. The jokes, the dismissive comments about his mother's accent, her background, or her alleged lack of substance. Usually, he chose to let them roll off his back. Growing up under constant public scrutiny had taught him the value of restraint. But something about the professor's flamboyant performance rubbed him the wrong way today. Maybe it was the sly condescension in Lang's eyes. Maybe it was the unchallenged laughter from so many classmates. Or maybe Barron had finally reached his limit. "As I always say," Lang went on, pacing near the edge of the stage, "if you want to play in the big leagues of politics, you should bring more to the table than a photogenic smile." He advanced the slideshow, but the image of Melania lingered a moment longer before fading to black. Enough time to drive home his point. Enough time for Barron to feel each snicker slicing through the air. Enough time for a decision to form in Barron's mind. When the image finally disappeared, Professor Lang turned to face the class with a satisfied grin. "Any questions so far?" he asked, leaning against the lectern. A few murmurs drifted around. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the auditorium, Barron's deep but measured voice cut through the tension. I have one, Barron said, raising his hand ever so slightly. Instantly, heads whipped around, necks craned, and eyes locked onto him. Barron Trump rarely spoke in class, let alone asked a question. The professor's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he quickly recovered. He'd known from the roster that a certain B. Trump was enrolled, but he had never drawn direct attention to it, until now. Yes, Lang said, feigning a polite tone. Go ahead. Barron stood, his height making him impossible to ignore. You've mentioned the accomplishments of other first ladies, he said, voice level. You've spent time highlighting what you consider my mother's failures or perceived contradictions. But are you really sure you understand who she is beyond the headlines? A murmur coursed through the hall. Professor Lang's smirk faltered slightly. I'm speaking of public perception, he replied smoothly. What we observe in the media, what's widely reported. That's exactly the problem, Barron interrupted, his tone courteous but firm. The media is often about sound bites, punchlines, and ratings. You're repeating the same tired lines without looking any deeper. It's lazy. A collective hush gripped the room. Never had anyone openly challenged Lang like this, especially not with such calm precision. Several students were suddenly typing furiously, capturing every word on their laptops. Others stared wide-eyed, their gazes dancing between the professor and Barron as if they were ringside at a boxing match. Lang cleared his throat. Lazy? He echoed, his voice tinged with mild offense. Care to elaborate? Barron nodded once. Sure, he said. My mother, as you know, didn't come from a wealthy background. She worked. She modeled. She navigated an industry that isn't exactly gentle on women, especially those with accents, to achieve her own financial independence. And she did that before ever meeting my father. Does that even factor into your analysis, or is it easier to reduce her to a punchline? Lang opened his mouth, but no words came out immediately. A smattering of impressed whispers spread through the students. Barron was not raising his voice, not trying to overpower anyone. If anything, he sounded genuinely curious, almost academic. Look, Lang started, regaining some composure. I'm not denying she had a modeling career. I'm simply examining how public figures are perceived, especially when there appears to be a contradiction between their platform and their personal life. Barron's eyes narrowed. I'm all for examining public figures, he replied. But there's a line between respectful critique and mocking someone purely for comedic effect. Why belittle her accent, or her Be Best initiative, or her marriage? Does it elevate our discourse to do that? The professor pressed his lips together. A tense hush took hold again. The large auditorium, once so alive with laughter, now felt oddly intimate. About half the students looked uncomfortable, the others mesmerized. A few had their phones out, discreetly recording. Lang forced a polite chuckle. Well, I certainly never belittled her accent, he said. But the contradictions surrounding Be Best and her spouse's online behavior, those are factual points people often raise. Then talk about them thoughtfully, Barron said, voice still steady. You're a respected academic, not a late-night comedian. If you want to discuss contradictions, discuss them. But do it in a way that provides actual insight, not cheap barbs. His words landed like a gavel. A wave of tension pulsed through the hall as students waited for the professor's rebuttal. But Lang seemed momentarily at a loss. The practiced sarcasm wasn't working, and his target was not the easy punchline he had expected. Barron settled back into his seat, not out of deference, but out of an unspoken understanding that he'd made his point. The next few seconds stretched unbearably. Then, from the back row, someone clapped, a solitary, resonant clap that seemed to break the spell. Another followed, then a few more. Soon the applause grew, unsure at first, then steadier, like raindrops gathering into a downpour. Lang cleared his throat again, glancing at the screen behind him as if searching for rescue in the next slide. Yes, well, he began, why don't we move on to the broader topic of media sensationalism? It was a pivot that didn't feel entirely natural. The once cocky professor showed hints of unease. By the end of that class, the atmosphere had shifted in a way that even the most casual observer could sense. Students filed out in hushed conversation, glancing sidelong at Barron. They'd expected a typical lecture, maybe more of the professor's comedic flair. Instead, they had witnessed a moment of raw confrontation where the usual power dynamic had flipped. Barron walked toward the exit, face composed, shoulders set. He was used to scrutiny, but this was different. Today he'd chosen to speak in a realm that thrived on cynicism. He felt a strange sense of relief, as though a burden had been temporarily lifted. A few classmates hovered near the doorway, seemingly debating whether to talk to him. He offered a short nod and continued on his way. Outside, a warm afternoon sun lit the stone paths crisscrossing Brown's historic campus. Students bustled around, rushing to their next class or meeting friends for lunch. Barron took a deep breath. He'd grown up surrounded by headlines and public speculation, yet forging his own path at Brown had been an attempt to find normalcy, if normalcy was even possible for someone like him. But normal or not, there was a conversation in the lecture hall that had needed to happen. He didn't regret it. He headed to the library to finish some reading, but before he could find a secluded spot, he noticed a small group trailing behind him. 3 students, 2 guys and 1 girl, each with expressions ranging from awe to shyness. The girl, with short curly hair dyed lavender at the tips, was the one who mustered the courage to speak first. "Barron?" she ventured, her voice resonating softly in the archway leading into the library. He turned. "Yes. I just wanted to say, that was really something in class today," she said, sounding a touch breathless. The 2 guys behind her nodded in agreement. One of them, sporting a navy hoodie, added, "I've never seen Lang shut down like that. He's usually unstoppable." Barron shrugged. "He wasn't shut down," he answered, a hint of modesty coloring his tone. "He just got called out on lazy jokes. I don't mind critical discussions, but personal digs bother me." The other guy, wearing thick-framed glasses, looked thoughtful. "I know a lot of people think your family invites that kind of criticism, but it was refreshing to see you draw a boundary, like let's talk about real issues, not just cheap laughs." Barron nodded. He appreciated their support, though he wasn't keen on lingering in the spotlight. "Thanks," he said. "Anyway, it is what it is. I've got to get some reading done before my next class." "Of course," the girl said, "but seriously, thanks for speaking up." He gave a small wave and headed deeper into the library. The weight of countless eyes still felt like a ghost on his shoulders, but the sense of having stood up for something meaningful eased that tension. If the professor's remarks had gone unchallenged, the snickering would have continued, fueling more demeaning commentary. Standing up even once could shift the whole atmosphere. Barron found a corner table near the history section. He pulled out his laptop, started working on a paper about post-war economic policies, and let himself slip into the academic zone. Studying offered a reprieve, a world of data, citations, and theories that had nothing to do with tabloid commentary. Meanwhile, back in the lecture hall, the next class was already gathering, but some students lingered, discussing the encounter in hushed tones. Professor Lang himself remained at the front, flipping through slides as if to feign an air of nonchalance. Yet anyone who glanced his way could see the tension creasing his brow. Something about Barron's calm retort had unsettled him, pricked at his theatrical persona. Maybe it was because it came from someone he'd assumed would never speak up, or maybe because it exposed how shallow his jokes truly were. Unaware of the storm brewing among the student body's group chats, Barron continued his reading. He occasionally glanced at his phone to see a flood of messages from classmates who had never bothered to text him before, each praising his boldness or asking him to elaborate on his mother's philanthropic efforts. Some messages were supportive, others borderline voyeuristic. He decided to ignore them for the time being. Later that evening after dinner, Barron made his way back to his dorm, a stately, ivy-covered building typical of Brown's campus. The autumn air was crisp. As he approached the large wooden doors, a familiar figure materialized out of the shadows. "Hey," greeted Jason Winston, a teaching assistant in the political discourse department. He was a few years older than Barron with a quiet demeanor, but he commanded respect among students for his thoughtful approach and fair-minded perspective. "Jason, what's up?" Barron asked, sliding his ID card to unlock the doors. Jason followed him in. "You made some waves today in Lang's lecture. I wanted to check on you." Barron tapped the button for the elevator, stepping aside to let Jason in. "I'm fine," he replied, forcing a small, polite smile. "I just had to say something." Jason nodded, leaning against the elevator wall as the doors slid shut. Lang's known for towing the line, but even he seemed surprised. He was definitely surprised, Barron agreed. "I wasn't planning to speak up, but I couldn't sit there while he made a mockery of someone he's never met." As the elevator ascended, Jason studied Barron's expression. "What you said about your mother, that needed to be heard. Even if people disagree with her or your father, it doesn't justify cheap shots at someone's background." Barron breathed out a laugh that held no real humor. "You'd think so, but a lot of folks seem to think it's open season on my family. Still, I don't mind genuine criticism. I just can't stand shallow insults." They stepped off on Barron's floor. The corridor was quiet, mostly shut doors and low, muffled voices from other rooms. Jason cleared his throat. "Listen, I know you probably get swamped with questions about your family. If you ever need to talk or just decompress, I'm around. Sometimes it's good to vent. Barron appreciated the offer. Thanks, he said. Might take you up on that. Jason gave him a supportive nod and headed back toward the elevator. Barron slid his key into his dorm room lock, pushing the door open. Warm lamplight and familiar surroundings greeted him. A minimalist space, a single bed, a simple desk, a bookshelf crammed with political theory and economics texts. He set his bag down, exhaled, and let the tension of the day roll off his shoulders. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he'd confronted Professor Lang was already spreading across social media platforms frequented by Brown students. By nightfall, video snippets popped up on Facebook and Instagram, capturing the exchange. A flurry of comments flooded in, some applauding Barron for defending his mother, others criticizing him or the professor, or both. In a corner of campus within a cramped dorm room stacked with laundry and half-eaten bags of chips, sophomore Alicia Chow scrolled through a video of Barron. "Damn," she muttered to her roommate. "I always thought he was super quiet, but he just lit that professor up." Her roommate took a peek and gasped softly. A junior named Tristan, who ran an influential student blog, decided to write an editorial about political bias and the role of academic professionals, referencing Barron's stance as a prime example of pushing back against personal attacks. By midnight, a wave of commentary from alumni and external Twitter accounts had begun. Barron's phone lit up repeatedly, but he'd placed it on silent, unaware of the growing buzz. Morning came, and Barron made his way to the cafeteria. Heads turned, eyes locked on him like he was a campus celebrity, but he tried to brush it off. After grabbing scrambled eggs and toast, he found a quiet corner table. Before he could even take a bite, Alicia, the sophomore who'd watched his video, approached with two friends in tow. "Hey, sorry to bother you," she began with a shy smile, "but we watched the clip from Lang's class. That was, well, it was awesome." Barron managed a faint grin. "Thanks," he said, though he had no illusions about the ephemeral nature of campus viral fame. He motioned for them to sit, unsure if he should expect a barrage of questions or just friendly conversation. They took the seats, each with an excited energy. "I think a lot of us respect that you stood up for your mom," the second friend chimed in. "It's easy for people to forget public figures are human." Barron nodded slowly, carefully selecting his words. "They do forget. Or maybe they just don't care. But empathy is supposed to be part of academic discourse, not just cold analysis or sarcastic jabs." Alicia's eyes lit up. "That's exactly it. People get so wrapped up in their opinions about your father that they forget there's a whole person behind the name Trump. It's refreshing to see you own that in a real way." He thanked them again, took a few bites of his now lukewarm eggs, and kept the conversation polite yet brief. Though he was grateful for the support, this sudden surge of attention was exhausting. After finishing his meal, he headed to his next lecture, navigating stares and occasional nods. Some people smiled in solidarity, others gave him a wide berth. A handful seemed outright uncomfortable, especially those who had laughed along with Lang. That day, as Barron slid into a seat in another classroom, a smaller seminar focused on ethics in modern governance, he noticed a ripple of whispers. The professor, a reserved woman named Dr. Hernandez, acknowledged him with a subtle nod, as though signaling that she too had heard about his stand. Her lecture began without fanfare, diving into real ethical dilemmas faced by political leaders. This time, Barron found solace in the fact that no one singled him out. Meanwhile, in an office adorned with framed degrees and books, Professor Lang sat at his desk, staring at his inbox. Emails from faculty peers, students, even journalists from the local press had poured in since the video surfaced. Some wanted to praise him for encouraging debate. Others condemned what they saw as unprofessional jabs at a public figure's spouse. One email pointed out how academically lazy it was to resort to personal mockery rather than constructing a balanced critique. Lang leaned back in his leather chair, letting out a long breath. His arrogance was dented, but self-reflection was not his strong suit. He told himself he was simply being provocative, and that Barron's reaction was an overreaction. Yet a small part of him couldn't ignore the unraveling effect it was having on his once unassailable confidence. By late afternoon, the campus buzz reached a new pitch. Students discussed the incident in nearly every corner, in the quad, in coffee shops, during study groups. Barron found himself at the epicenter, a reluctant figure in a swirl of debates about free speech, respectful discourse, and the blurred lines between policy criticism and personal ridicule. He spent that afternoon in the library again, working on a paper in comparative politics, determined to maintain his routine. But a persistent thought gnawed at him. Had he done the right thing by calling out Lang in front of everyone? Or should he have approached the professor privately? He replayed the scene, searching for any sign that he'd stepped over a line. He knew in his gut he hadn't. Sometimes you had to show people where the boundaries were. That evening, as he approached his dorm, he found Jason Winston waiting in the lobby. "I hear the campus reporter from the Herald wants to interview you," Jason said, referencing the prominent student newspaper. Barron hesitated, an uneasy wave rolling through his stomach. He wasn't a fan of giving interviews. "They reached out," he admitted. "I haven't responded. I'm not trying to become some poster boy for anything." Jason gave him a reassuring look. "I know, but consider it. You opened a conversation about how far academics can go when critiquing public figures. That's important. You might help shift the narrative to something more constructive than tabloid-level mockery." Barron rubbed the back of his neck, mulling it over. "Maybe, but you also know how easily things can be twisted." Jason nodded. "Yeah, it's a risk. But sometimes the right words at the right moment can steer the conversation in a better direction." Barron sighed, shuffling the keys in his hand. "I'll think about it." They parted ways, and Barron retreated to his room. That night, messages continued pouring in, but he had no energy to respond. He flicked on some music, hoping it would drown out the tumult of campus chatter drifting through his open window. He tried to focus on his coursework. Occasionally, he scrolled through social media, glimpsing headlines like "Barron Trump slams professor for mocking Melania," and "Academic freedom or personal attack." He quickly shut it down, not wanting to spiral. The next day, an anonymous letter appeared in his campus mailbox. Barron retrieved it from the old-school metal slot near the dorm's entrance. Plain white envelope, nothing indicating who had sent it. Inside was a single sheet of typed paper. "Thank you for reminding us that civility matters. A fellow student." Barron's lips curved into a small, appreciative smile. That note might have meant more to him than any public show of approval.